Hello and welcome to another episode of the JRE review. Today I'm reviewing episode 1249 with Donnell Rawlings. It's pretty awesome. Donnell is probably best known for his appearances on the Chappell show, and if you've watched that comedy series and remember a lot of the great skits in there, Donnell is a big part of those. Mostly a guy kind of in the background or to the side of the main people in it, but has some great lines, very funny dude, and is a really good comic. His conversation with Joe was pretty lighthearted, and it's always good when Joe has comedians on. I think it just gives a different feel to his podcast. He's almost a little bit looser. Everyone obviously gets a bit sillier, and this conversation is another example of that. So let's start the review.
Welcome to the Joeroganexperiencereview, where each week I review every single episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. What more do you want?
So obviously, like I said, Donnell is one of the guys from the Chappell show. He worked alongside Dave Chappell, making that incredible show, or like whatever parts he was involved in, and has been a comic before and ever since then. Chappell's show was the best, really. Joe talks about it, and if you haven't seen it, let's say you're a bit younger, because it's an older show now. I mean, that show is, 15 years old, maybe? I think it's like 2005, maybe a bit before that. Or maybe, I don't know. It's around that time. So it's not, it's not all that new. And I don't know what generations of people are keeping up with it and whether it holds up, but it was the funniest thing of its time. It was raw, and Chappell really just said whatever he wanted on that. He made some outrageous skits that were absolutely hilarious. The Rick James one is still watchable to this day, and the Prince one in the same way. Oftentimes, when I look at my YouTube feed, if a Chappelle show skit kind of pops up in it, it's one of those that as soon as I see it, I have to put it on. They were never that long, and they're each one, and they were just so funny. It was unbelievable. The KKK skit, if you're listening to this and you've never watched the Dave Chappelle KKK skit, 100% put that on immediately and watch it. It's so good. Donnell talked a little bit with Joe about just censorship in his own right, and Joe's questions about the control that Comedy Central had. Obviously, during the third season of the Chappelle show, Dave Chappelle walked away from that. It's pretty well known. I don't even know why I'm talking about it really, but he walked away, and it's like, why? And the thought was really that Comedy Central just kind of came down on him about his language, how he was talking, what he was portraying, and they were worried that like advertisers would lose out, blah blah blah. And I think this is the dialogue that Joe understood. As far as I understood it, that was as much as I knew. And obviously Joe's like super close to all these different comedians, so I would have thought he really knew where it was coming from. But Donnell actually explained that he didn't think that Comedy Central was necessarily putting too much pressure on Dave. And he kind of alludes to that during this conversation, and also that he didn't really ask Dave about it. He was just happy for the friendship and all the rest of it, and Dave just needed to go. And that guy, Dave Chappelle, I've seen him a few times just walking in the comedy store. Obviously, when he shows up, everyone just lets him do his thing, and he'd be on stage for hours. But both Joe and Donnell were talking about just the impact of knowing him, how free and loose he is, and how where Dave is funny is how he's speaking the truth, but he doesn't hold back. And most importantly, he owns it, right? So there's all this outrage culture, and these comedians are concerned about what they're up to and what they're saying. But as long as they own it, like, many of the greats do, then you can power through that. It's just, I guess, when these guys get nervous and start kind of apologizing for what they're saying, things get messed up. And that makes sense. I mean, the level of comics that these guys are, it's really interesting for me to hear that and think what they're up against, because you see good comedians on the television or YouTube or whatever, and you're thinking to yourself, obviously they've worked hard for that. That's incredibly difficult. But you don't think about the jokes they weren't able to use or the things they weren't able to say. They had to dial it back, and finding that fine line between how far back do you have to dial it to still make it true to you and funny, and also how far do you keep it where it's still, a little bit outrageous. I mean, it's tough, and it must be a weird thing for them too, because I wonder if comedians think about how it will hold up in time. Like maybe they say something today, but in 10 years' time, it's going to be seen as a really messed up thing to say. I wonder if they're starting to worry about that. I mean, who knows? But their point is you got to be brave with your stand-up and go up after great people. That's another thing that Joe was talking to Donnell about, is following really good people is very difficult. And he talked about Martin Lawrence in the 90s. I mean, following someone with great energy and that's really good, I mean, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be hard because the crowd has just gone wild for, 20, 30 minutes. And now they're kind of a little bit like almost mentally exhausted. So when the new comedian comes on, the energy kind of drops and people are kind of done with that much laughing. And that's it. They have to pick up that energy. So I'm sure Rogan or any comedian that follows killers learns a great deal. Joe Rogan's talked about it before with Joey Diaz, following him and his energy. And if you've ever seen Joey Diaz's comedy, and especially if you've seen him live, you know exactly what that means. I mean, he is something else. He's just so funny, so much energy. He's a powerhouse of comedy. And going after him, I mean, the audience is almost exhausted. You'd have to go out and just do backflips for 10 minutes. I don't know. It would be tough. It would be really tough. Joe talks to Donnell about doing a podcast. They get into that, and it's very funny. And I think he wanted to call it Too Soon with Donnell Rawlings. But Joe really pushes him for it, and lots of points on this. And, it's like one of those things. Joe says, maybe I say this too much to people, but you should start a podcast. And he thinks that it would be very good at it, and also that Donnell might be one of the top podcasts in the country. So after Donnell is kind of done rating Joe Rogan's weed box that he has like a chest full of weed, and Donnell's just like, holy shit, just gets in there and starts taking whatever he wants. Joe once again was like reiterating the value of doing the podcast, and it's not just about him as an individual and his name. Like Donnell Rawlings, people will know who he is, so therefore they download his podcast. Joe says it's not about that. It's about the network that they have. So the network is huge, and everyone gets a bump. So everyone goes on everyone's show, right? Which is a really cool thing. And Donnell points that out, and he says this is a huge positive message. And it's like what Joe is pushing is networks, the idea of networks. So I ask yourself in your life, what kind of networks do you have? Because Joe says the same thing about comedy. It was like, for a while, there was like a scarcity idea, that there were only a few spots and everything was competition. Well, that isolates you, keeps you alone. If you see everything as a network, you see it as everyone's working together, that you can learn from everybody, that you can work with everybody, and everyone gets a push. It's like Donnell Rawlings went on Bert Kreischer's show recently, his cooking show, and was very funny. That gives Bert a jump, a boost. It also gives Donnell a boost. The same is going on Rogan's podcast, but it also gives Rogan a boost because he's a good guest to have. And it's just a really nice message that Joe puts out. Like, obviously, there are people that create conflict, and they, maybe at your work or in your life or other areas, that make you forget about the value of keeping a good network and getting the positives out of knowing certain people, and working together with other people. It gets you out of that mind frame. But they do exist. It is possible. And, these guys, comics, at this level, really starting to stick together, and they're making a ton of success for themselves. I mean, Joe Rogan might be the conduit of it, but a lot of people are getting it down. Ari Shaffir has a fantastic podcast, and Joe even says it's hard when you're alone, right? It's hard when you're struggling, and that makes you feel alone, but you're not. And there is a network of people that want to work with you out there and help you get ahead, and you help them get ahead. And again, it's just one of those nice positive messages that you get. He says there's no real competition, and it's good for everybody. So it's like a community thing, you know. It's just one of those messages that you got to tell yourself in a lot of ways. Easy to forget, and then just get frustrated. But anyway, this conversation with Joe and Donnell was not only ridiculously funny in parts, but just a real eye-opener in a lot of ways to the life of these comics and these guys on TV and these sorts of things. So anyway, thanks for downloading. I appreciate you guys. Check out the podcast.